Thank you very much, Loretta, and thank you everyone for coming. If I pronounce it Norcia the other night, then I'm moving towards Italian, whereas Federica and Francesco are moving towards English. So we're a perfect example of moving in both directions.
Translingualism.
Translingualism. What I want to do in this paper is simply suggest ways that we might uncover hidden dimensions of the Italian presence in Australia before mass migration. And for our non-Australian visitors, I'm talking about mass migration beginning in 1948, when the Australian government signed agreements with the European countries. My starting point for this, and one of my reasons for embarking on this project, is my belief that Australian multiculturalism is being overtaken by the geopolitical revolutions of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The ideology that became Australian policy in the early 1970s is now used to divide and destabilise as often as it is to unite and build. Seems to me the national conversation about ethnicity, identity and nation building is stalled, as the rhetoric of 40 years ago cannot cope with the new context. I think I was struck on Wednesday evening at our opening ceremony how Sir James Gover gave a beautiful history of the achievements of Italians and other groups in the 1960s and 70s to have multicultural policies enshrined in legislation. But then once that part of the evening was over, we then had a presentation about Indigenous Australia, and the exclusion of Indigenous Australians from the multicultural discourse seems to me a problem which needs to be addressed. The recent opening ceremony of the Commonwealth Games in Brisbane is just the most recent public manifestation of a very deep wound in the Australian nation. And the second reason for claiming that multiculturalism in its earlier form is running out of steam is that the evolving nature of migration and the growing range of countries of origin of migrants to Australia, plus the ongoing refugee crisis, is exhausting the theoretical grounds of the multiculturalism that got Australia from the 1960s to the 1990s. And I noticed that Loretta, in her keynote yesterday, noted that Australian understandings of multiculturalism are being challenged by developments in Italy and other European countries. These debates are happening at a political level as well as at an academic level. And I want to quote from policy statements from the One Nation Party. My Australian colleagues know what I'm talking about. And before you dismiss these as being the ravings of a few crackpots, let me remind you that the federal government now has representatives from One Nation from 3 different states, from Queensland, Western Australia and New South Wales. Who knows who's going to be next? Their latest policy statements on the website include these statements. The contributions of migrants and their families to Australia is undeniable when migrants come to embrace our way of life and not to change it. We support English as Australia's official language because it's a unifying force and advances migrant communities as well as Australia's interests. We recognise the value of heritage languages and we encourage their preservation. Last year in the elections in Western Australia, the local branch of the One Nation Party included these statements in their official policies. Multiculturalism is negative and divisive, a weight that is drowning our once safe and cohesive society. A homogeneous culture is a happy one. As a government policy, multiracialism encompassed measures to destroy the Australian culture. Now, these statements seem to me to be based on 2 assumptions, an ideological assumption and a historical assumption. The ideological assumption is that homogeneity brings happiness, and that happiness depends on homogeneity. Difference, therefore, brings disturbance, confusion, and unhappiness. The second historical assumption is that Australia was once homogeneous. It was once monolingual, monocultural, and happy. And then in the 1940s and 50s was disturbed by something that became known as multiculturalism. I want to contest both of those assumptions, in particular the historical one. To stay in the political arena for a little moment, another Australian senator, Penny Wong, has articulated a different view of Australia's pre-mass migration history. In an address to the National Press Club in 2016, she said this: "The myth of a uniformly Anglo-Saxon Australia airbrushes out of our history the Afghan camel drivers, the Chinese working the goldfields, the Japanese pearl divers, and the hundreds of thousands of Irish migrants who came here during the 19th century. And at last we can stop talking about Anglo-Celtic, as if that was a single unit. I understand from an Italian point of view that makes sense, but being the descendant of English and Irish, to put the two in the same category just doesn't make any sense at all." Senator Wong goes on, this myth blots out the Pacific Islanders brought here to work the cane fields. It ignores the Holocaust survivors and refugees who made a new life in Australia after the Second World War, let alone, she says, the centuries of shared history, trade and cultural links between Indigenous Australians and the Macassan traders of the Indonesian archipelago. So in our political arena we have two very, very different views, not just of the present, but of the past. What can we as scholars do to try and investigate these contesting claims of Australia's homogeneous or heterogeneous linguistic past? My main claim is that for Australian history before 1948, the census is not an adequate instrument. And I know that John Hajek will be speaking to us now about how useful the census is for present realities. But for earlier days, I think that the census is woefully inadequate. I haven't got any data with me here, but I have counted Italians, for example, in Western Australia during the 19th century, and the census is always out by a long way, because I know the names of the Italians who were there, and the numbers are just wrong. Another reason for believing that the census is not adequate is that mainstream histories of Australia do not include different language communities in their story of the formation of the Australian people, the Australian consciousness, and the Australian state. Even recent authoritative histories like the Oxford History of Australia, the Cambridge History of Australia, mention various language communities, but in a kind of marginal way. We're a kind of a side dish to the main thing happening, which is Anglo-Australian. Different language groups are telling their own stories, and the history of non-Anglophone communities is being told, but these stories tend to focus on particular outstanding individuals and describe contributions made by Italians and others to Australian life in a way that smacks of justification. We deserve to be here because we've contributed to the economy or to culture or to something else. But there's little explicit description of language usage in any of these local histories that I've read. The language is, as it were, taken for granted, but never explored and documented. There are some analyses of language in pre-colonial Australia that make some very strong claims. Gerhard Leitner, in his book of a few years ago, entitled Australia's Many Voices, makes this simple but challenging observation. Linguistic diversity was a pervasive feature of colonial Australia. Now, Leitner amasses impressive evidence of a network of languages crisscrossing the complex fabric of early Australian society. He mainly uses evidence which had been brought together by Michael Klein, whose groundbreaking studies provided an account of the language diversity in Australia, particularly from 1861 to 1921. But Klein acknowledges that those figures of his were based on census figures and essentially count people according to their birthplace. So if a person was born in a certain place, it's assumed they spoke a certain language. And that equation between birthplace and language is approximate at best. So as I said, the census is inadequate for early times. The figures are often wrong. The use of birthplace is inadequate. And the third reason for us Italianists is that Italy has a very particular language history that makes it particularly difficult to grasp Italian language use in a place like Australia. In fact, Leitner in his book almost dismisses Italian as a language of early Australia when he says Italian at this time, late 19th century, did not have a standard language and Italians remained dialect speakers. This observation, I think, in a paradoxical way, suggests a way forward for us, a new way of looking back at the past. We need new materials and new methods, and I think that Australian Italianists are particularly well placed to make a new contribution to these national conversations. If we look at the history of and the historiography of Italian since unification, I think there are lessons there that we can apply to Australia. As many people will know, in 1963, Tullio De Mauro performed an extraordinary service to linguists by constructing a methodology to estimate the number of Italian speakers at unification. He had two assumptions. First, Italian was a written language based on 14th century Florentine, and therefore you could estimate Italian speakers by counting people who completed secondary school, people who lived in Rome, and people who lived in central Tuscany. Now that work was so new and so groundbreaking and so authoritative, it's become something of a dogma and has been quoted over and over again, so that two generations of my students know that the number of Italians, or the percentage of Italians who spoke Italian in 1861 was 2.5%. Out comes De Mauro's figure. Now the figures have been revised by adjusting the parameters, so if you count people who finished primary school or people who come from the central regions of Italy, Umbria, the southern Marche and so on. And so Arrigo, Castellani and Luca Seriani revised the figures upwards but never got above 12.5%. There's been basically no serious rethink of the methodological approach that De Mauro used at all until the 1990s, when a series of different strands of research began to converge to give a new picture based on a new set of assumptions. This new picture comes from 5 new sources which had never been looked at before. Firstly, reports of travellers to Italy in the 18th and 19th century. For example, Charles Dickens, on his trip around Italy, says that he had conversations with fishermen in Genova, I think, and peasants in Calabria. How the hell did you have a conversation with fishermen if they didn't speak some Italian? Secondly, evidence of widespread social practices such as communal reading books out loud, and the distribution of penny catechisms that encourage at least passive competence, if not active competence in Italian. Thirdly, the use of Italian in preaching and as the language of business in the Catholic Church, as we've just heard. De Mauro himself called Italian the Church's langue de guerre, its war language. Fourthly, documentary evidence of the use of Italian as a language of diplomacy and trade in the Mediterranean and in dealings with the Ottoman Empire. And fifthly, writings of migrants. Now, these new sets of evidence allow us to ask new questions. And the new understandings of the dynamics of language acquisition and of interpersonal communication suggest that we need to rethink the history of Italian as a language of communication, and that will help us rethink the history of Italian in Australia. And the same move from counting numbers to narrating experience may be the key to a new look at the history of Italian in Australia. Little is known about how the language diversity of Italians was actually lived out through the use of languages other than English as languages of everyday conversation. Only Michael Klein, again, investigated the use of languages rather than the statistical occurrence of languages in 19th century Australia. In a paradigmatic case study, he left us a memorial description of multilingual Melbourne 19th century style. A beautiful study with detailed observations of language variety in 5 distinct domains: media, transactional domains, church, clubs and societies, and education. But this study, to my knowledge, has remained unreplicated elsewhere around the country, which is a pity, because it's an exemplary and illuminating account, which would be a model for a new Australian sociology of language in a historical perspective, asking the question, who spoke which languages to whom in which situations. But the move, though, needs to be away from the sociology of language towards an ethnography of language. This will require us to not focus on counting people, but observing behaviour and retelling stories. It will require us to separate the language macro skills, as we just heard from Federica and Francesco, where people will have different abilities in receptive language skills versus productive language skills. We just saw a Spanish monk getting a letter in German and replying in Italian. Seems to me that's normal, and we should, but it doesn't figure in the usual models we use to analyse language. A move from a sociology of language to an ethnography of language will require us to accept as normal practices such as code switching, translanguaging, crossing, and so on, to move away from standard languages as the measure of language competence and use, and to abandon the idea of native speaker. We still talk, linguists still talk about things like code switching and translanguaging as if they were new, as if we discovered or even invented them. But I was reading something the other day about language usage in ancient Greece and Rome, and I came across this interesting statement. Bilingualism is neither new nor rare. Studies of hunter-gatherer communities around the world suggest that bilingualism and multilingualism might have been the rule rather than an exception among the earliest human societies. And we certainly know that in Australia, where multilingualism was the norm among indigenous societies. Bilingualism survived the invention of writing and the formation of empires in the ancient world. So I'm surprised that we still talk about switching codes as if it's a violation of some inherent norms. The way to uncover the ethnography of language before 1947 is, of course, to dig into the archives, and that means we're working with written records, which have a whole series of questions that we need to ask about the relationship between written language and spoken language. We're lucky in a sense, being Italianists, that the identity of Italians as marginal members of the Australian community during 150 years meant that they were often suspected of something. They were either suspected of being Austrians in the First World War, or they were suspected of being fascists, or then they were suspected of being communists. They were suspected of being something or other. And so our national archives are bulging with records collected by the police, the military, and security forces in Australia, to say nothing of private collections around the country. The story that will emerge from this new account of the Italian in a multilingual Australia will not be quantifiable and will not be supported by numbers. The story rather will consist of stories of how people lived with their language, with their languages. This, I think, is where we should look for a new history of language in Australia before mass migration. Thank you.